I'd like to introduce myself. I am the new Deputy Publisher at iPolitics. Many of you know my predecessor, Sally Douglas, the incomparable Sally Douglas. So I have very big shoes to fill, but I'll do my best tonight. Many of you are familiar with iPolitics. For those of you who aren't, we are a team of Canadian content creators. We are multi-platform solutions producing original news, parliamentary intelligence, and turnkey events such as this one, which we can do for you if you're ever interested. So basically it's our goal to keep your finger on the pulse of Canadian politics. That's what we wake up for every day. Because we think that journalism and accurately reporting what's going on in Parliament is the oxygen of a healthy democracy. Which brings us to the Canada's Copyright Act, which is currently under review. Part of our mandate at iPolitics is to provide you, as I said, with everything you need. So we're going to talk a little bit later about a new product we have called the Copyright Hub, which is one-stop shopping for everything copyright related. So in addition to what we discuss here tonight, there will be a lot more for you to tap into. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening. He is the founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of iPolitics. But he's not just a seasoned journalist, he's an innovator. Nobody was covering Canadian federal politics exclusively online until James Baxter decided to take up that mantle, and he's created an incubator for up-and-coming talent, and he's basically elucidating the Canadian public on what's going on in our parliamentary system. So it is my honor to introduce James Baxter, your moderator for the evening.
Thank you, Heather. You're filling those shoes wonderfully, and it's great to have you. I wish I could take credit for being an innovator. I just couldn't afford a printing press, although they're cheap now. So, and many thanks to all of you guys for showing up. It's a beautiful patio day. It would have probably been a rotten day to be stuck in traffic. So hopefully we'll have a spirited conversation here, and then the drive home will be an easy one. I'd also like to thank our panel, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to sit with two good friends, which I'll explain in a bit, and four of the smartest people who live and breathe this intellectual property battle or debate. Battle yet. It's going to be a battle. Maybe not a battle yet. Michael Geist, I've got him out of order here, unfortunately. I've got him out of here. Michael Geist, who needs almost no introduction, but few have been more vocal or prescient in the need for an evolving set of copyright and intellectual property laws, because I think you've been out ahead of the technological wave for a long time and understand why old laws don't necessarily fit anymore. Barry Fong, who's next to him, is actually fair to say a courtroom veteran on these files, or ideally you don't get to court, is I guess what most lawyers would say. but actually does the day-to-day battling on very complex copyright and intellectual property issues. And then immediately to my left is Valerie Galley-Bellegarde, who's probably I've got it written here because Valerie's a wonderful friend, but I also have to note she's the country's leading champion of Indigenous languages and oral history. Is that a fair languages?
I don't know if they're
but you told me some great stories. which I actually, it was as we were preparing for this, it became apparent that that's just a fairly new, it's an old problem, but a new issue in law and in our society. And I think I'm looking forward to having that discussion. And down the end there is one of my great friends, Andy Del Castillo, who is president of R&D Creative, which is a video and audio producing company. He is also known to many of us as the lead singer of 8 Seconds, those of us with gray hair anyway, which was a big band, I have to say, toured with Wang Chung, among other things, in the 1980s. But you know him, even if you're not from the 1980s, you would know him as the composer of Ba 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 at Scotia. Do I owe you copyright? Or, I think I just infringed his copyright. But So, but he did at the Sens games. When you hear that, is it a trumpet sound? What is it? Trumpet sound. That is it. When I was asked whether I'd be willing to chair this, willing and able to chair it. I knew I was willing. I wasn't sure I was able because intellectual property to me these days seems like trying to build something on sand. The ground is always shifting underneath us, and just when we think that we have a handle on it, technology changes, the laws change, the culture changes in terms of society. Just it used to be you didn't steal stuff. Now stealing stuff is pretty commonplace. They don't call it stealing stuff even anymore. So anyway, I think that there's a lot that's going on. And so just when you think you've got to figure it out, it's not there anymore. So this is a question I'd like to start with, for all of you, and perhaps I'll start here with Val and pass this along. What makes this such a difficult issue now to define and to get a handle on?
Okay, good evening, everybody. So what makes this a difficult issue for the realm of Indigenous languages and other aspects of oral histories is copyright law allows for individual ownership rather than collective, I'll say ownership for lack of a better word, so that's the crux of it for us.
Sure. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's really technology has changed everything about copyright. Our Copyright Act dates back to the 1700s with the Statute of Anne, and it's been updated in Canada a few times.
That's what the CBC mandate.
Exactly, right. That's what the CBC said, right? And the Act has been updated a number of times, and the last time it was updated substantially was in 2012, of course we know that. But legislation is slow, but technology is fast, and we're in a period of disruption, and that's really what makes this very complicated.
I can use this one.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, great. So I'll provide a contrarian perspective. And I agree with everything you just said. Of course, technology creates new challenges. But the notion that somehow we're facing a new battle, that copyright is more challenging than it has been in the past, I actually don't think is right. If we go back, look at the reforms that took place in the 1980s, if we take a look again at the reforms that took place in the 1990s, pre some of the kinds of technologies that we're grappling with today, it was the same battles. It took literally a decade in both instances, sometimes even more, to get things passed. It took about 15 years for the process that resulted in 2012. And if anything, the decision to include the mandated 5-year review, I think was a mistake. That's not to suggest it's not valuable to regularly revisit copyright, but I think actually one of the lessons that we have had over 30 years worth of copyright reform is that it takes a long time for changes to permeate into the marketplace, have a full understanding of what's actually happening, and in some ways this 5-year process is too short.
There's a lady. No, just kidding.
Always love a microphone.
Lots of challenges. I mean, I can't disagree with the fact that technology's, evolved. It's a moving target. So being able to legislate or at least figure out how it is that, from my perspective, musicians, creators, artists are recognized is difficult. And I think that's where it is. I mean, is it easy to replace, to say, and it's really all about the internet. Is it easy to replace the internet, radio and television, or publishing with the internet? It's not. There's a lot of new challenges that occur, and I think it's important for creators to be able to get on the ground floor, because it being a moving target, there's going to be people that are going to want to exploit that situation. So the challenge is for everybody to come to the table and agree on what's fair in terms of compensation for creators.
On the legal front, Michael and Barry, the technology seems to, the technology moves quickly, the law, as you said, moves slowly. Are judges keeping up in terms of, do they understand the problems? Do they understand how how quickly something like a streaming service can come on and destroy as much wealth as it does, and are they able to cope with it?
Well, I know one judge that, in my view, wasn't. There was a case last summer that I think the judge got wrong involving access copyright at New York University. But generally speaking, actually, I would say the answer is I think for some, the answer may be surprisingly yes. In fact, our Supreme Court of Canada has heard more copyright cases over the last 10 to 15 years than they had in the prior 100. And if you look at those decisions, and frankly, if you look at it not just from a copyright perspective, but from a technology perspective, everything from examining liability associated with linking, to safe harbor related issues, to the panoply of challenges that we see taking place with the internet, I think they are able to grapple with it. And part of it is because I think a lot of these issues do go back to first principles. And that in many respects, a lot of these issues are the same. And so I would again note, for example, I see Brian Massey here, and I was listening to Brian just an hour ago at the industry committee, talking with the music industry, giving testimony that literally was the same testimony that was raised in the 1990s. I mean, you literally have an industry arguing for the cassette tape tax, arguing, or contribution, arguing that if we don't have that, musicians won't be recognized or paid, and they simply now want it as a government mandate. So in some ways, the technologies have changed, some of the arguments haven't.
I think that's right. I think it depends. So the Supreme Court certainly gets it right many of times, and they actually are always right. But there are some judges, depending who you draw, that might not get it, that don't understand the technology. And I'll give you an example, actually, not a judge in the judge context, but I do quite a bit of work for the Copyright Board of Canada. And they are typically older individuals that probably don't quite understand technology. I was involved in the first online streaming service hearing for ReSound, which is a collective that presents performance and record labels. And one of the challenges was explaining to the board what exactly this new streaming industry was, because at the time, everything was being compared to commercial radio or to webcasting, which was someone in their basement putting on the screen, and not the sophisticated types of services that you're seeing now, and I still don't think they got it. So that's a challenge when you're up against a panel that doesn't quite understand the technology that's happened or developed and what might come, and they have to keep that in mind in order to craft solutions that work for things that aren't even yet contemplated.
I guess sometimes, definitely, there are comparisons, and you can use the idea of, there's strange semantics at work here when you call things when you call fees for using an artist's work tariffs or taxes. I think that's a misnomer, but is it comparable to television and radio? Absolutely. I guess the challenge from an artistic perspective has always been the enforcement, the rigorous enforcement of laws that are there to make sure that compensation is made. Yes, you do have new media that needs to be, I hate using the word police, but taken into consideration when it comes to using someone else's property. But I think that's where it starts, is making sure that it's enforced. So there's a judge out there that might be, he or she might be a little older, not understanding the actual technology. It's important that they do, but more importantly, how can it be enforced? And I think that's really where it starts, enforcement.
Okay. I can't comment on decisions by judges, but what I can comment on is a phenomenon, so we'll turn this on its head. So our preoccupation, where our languages are concerned, is with our cultural survival, and language being fundamental to the existence of distinct peoples. So a few anecdotal examples are where linguists in academic institutions are concerned. So when they interview our fluent speakers and our old people and collect a language, that then belongs to them as the linguists. And what we're running into is people either repackaging it and holding it from the peoples whose elders they collected this from and saying, you can't have it unless you pay us for it. Secondly, because there is in fact a cadre of linguists who are getting on in age, who have some of the best collections of Indigenous languages and stories, is that they are passing on and their works are left to their estates, and some of their spouses just throw it out and don't make it available to the peoples from whom it's come.
Well, thanks for raising that. Actually, sort of brings me to the next question, which is again coming back to the evolution of copyright and patent and IP law, writ large. Drug companies are notorious for taking an old formulation, making a little twist, and calling it a new patent. Singers and songwriters are taking songs that have come out of copyright, putting their own twist on them, and then trying to market them and monetize them. How does our law evolve? And it may well be set up to do this, but I don't think a lot of us understand it. How does our law evolve to take to update intellectual property, update these things that, particularly as the internet takes them and amplifies them dramatically? Are we set up for that? Are our laws set up for that?
Okay. So you didn't end up where I thought you were going.
Oh, sorry. Tell me where I should have gone. I'll meet you there.
No, you raised two really interesting sort of avenues for discussion. Three, if we include patent discussion. So there was the notion of patent protections. There's sort of copyright and how does knowledge build on knowledge, and then there was a question of how do things keep pace. And they're all really good questions. I'll park the patents to the side for the moment, although I'm happy to engage in a discussion about how some of our trade agreements have, from our own parliamentary budget office, created an environment where we are going to pay hundreds of millions more in pharmaceutical costs, and based on decades-old agreements with the large pharmaceutical companies, see very little in return by way of increased investment in the country with us. In terms of copyright protects the expression, not the idea. So there are lots of people who have written about star-crossed lovers whose families are at odds with one another. Shakespeare did, obviously, but the notion that only Shakespeare could write about this in Romeo and Juliet is not the way copyright works. And it does so in a couple of ways. One, it does so by protecting the expression, the way you express something, not the ideas. This particular issue has been challenged a little bit right now if we try to modernize it in the discussion that's come before some of the copyright review hearings by actually some in the news media industry who we saw at least one witness argue for protection for exclusive news for at least a 24-hour period, which in a sense is a flip on the traditional copyright protection. So it would protect not just the expression, but arguably the ideas themselves. How it would work that if CTV got published an exclusive on something and nobody would be entitled to publish anything on it for 24 hours strikes me as insane. But nevertheless, that's the proposal supposedly to help the news industry. So part of it is this expression idea dichotomy. The other, very quickly, is that we limit the term of copyright. Currently, at life of the author plus 50 years, that is consistent with the international norm. There has been a strong effort by a number of groups before hearings of both industry and heritage to extend that term for an additional 20 years to life plus 70. One of the things that would do is make it more difficult for us to build on prior knowledge, because more of that knowledge would be locked down for a longer period of time.
You touched on a really raw spot for a lot of journalists in this room, which is CBC has learned.
Yes.
Perhaps 24 hours is ridiculous, but so is CBC has learned, and then basically giving your story verbatim. how would you, if, you know, if you had the judge's robes on, how would you arbitrate that? And what's a fair outcome for that?
It's not a copyright issue. That's the point. And I get the frustration. I rather listen to the Canalan story that tried to highlight some of that stuff. And as someone who blogs a lot of stuff that sometimes is the first to be blogged on it, to access information requests, I am familiar with other people writing
You actually benefit by
or rewriting my stuff, sometimes with a link back to my blog, sometimes not. So be it. I don't see that as a copyright issue. I think the value that a news organization brings and the willingness for people to go to it is based at least in part on that ability to both run exclusives, to make it understandable to users, to readers, and to continue to advance that story. And none of that has anything to do with protecting the specific expression.
Gain protection over facts, which you can't do through copyright. Certainly, the news organizations can protect the broadcast ability to describe the facts, but it's absurd to me to think that they would have exclusive rights over the story or the facts underlying that story for a certain amount of time. That's not what copyright is intended to do. And then to go back to your point, to have someone take a song that's not copyrighted and build something on it, that's the whole purpose of copyright, like Michael said and suggested. But there's also an amount that you can take from things that are still within copyright. We have fair dealing laws, or exceptions in Canada, that permit people to do that, to build on existing works and create new works. And that's part of the balance of copyright. In addition to fair dealing, there's also new exceptions that were introduced in 2012 in the Modernization Act for user-generated content. So we do have lots of exceptions that permit people, creative people, to make use of existing works and to build on that and to create and to add to the cultural story.
Sure. I can't disagree with that at all. I think the bigger issue, really, I guess as it pertains to music, to be honest with you, I think I'm on this panel because I have some interesting sort of anecdotes as a musician. And as a video producer, I've seen both sides where, you know, I've had to fight hard to get that remuneration of music that I've written or performed. But then as a video producer, I also, of course, use a lot of stock imagery and stock music that has to get paid for. And I think she's here, but my associate producer can vouch for the fact that, you know, we're very good about making sure that the people are paid, because that's one of our core beliefs. But really the bigger issue is to me that this new technology is coming along, and I mentioned the fact earlier that people might be in a position to exploit it, is they're fighting hard. They're fighting hard with money, and they're fighting hard, you know, with, you know, they get lawyered up and basically try to convince us that these new streams should not necessarily be taxed, or there shouldn't be tariffs on it. And you know, those are terms I'm not particularly comfortable with, because, you know, the example that I was thinking of, that if I were to steal my neighbor's car and then join Uber and start using it and started collecting money, you know, if finally, you know, my neighbor caught me and I got busted, if I went in front of a judge, he or she wouldn't say, you know, well, look, you're going to have to pay some tariffs for the money that you made. You're going to have to pay a percentage, right? Because it's not fair. It really wasn't your car that started, right? I get my ass thrown in jail. So I don't think there's any difference. If there's music on the internet, it doesn't matter whose dumb pipes they are, or if there's a, you know, I'm going to throw it wide open. You know, what's the purpose of an iPhone, right? You know, and what's the purpose what's the precursor to the iPhone, the iPod, the iPod. You know, people take advantage of it, and they use it. Apple, you know, really kind of did start this whole revolution. They're on the cusp of becoming the first $1 trillion company ever. You know, conservative pricing has not been an issue for them, right? I think a couple of cents on every dollar that they make is a reasonable way of saying, you know what, we are using somebody else's content to sell products. So follow the money. That's what I believe. You got to follow the money. Who's making money off of your work, and share it. When government gets involved, I'm a little skeptical of that, to be quite honest with you. Should they be setting the rates of what should be paid for a song? I don't know. I think there could be a natural, holistic relationship between technology and the creators of technology and those who have creative work. I think there can be. But as I said, I have to go back to enforcement. You know, the company that's all of a sudden wanting to, release a product that would innately use somebody else's intellectual property has to know that if you want to do business in Canada or wherever else, these are the laws. This is what you have to adhere to. That's the way I look at it. I don't consider that a little bit.
I just wanted to jump in on something.
Sure he does.
And I don't think anybody takes issue with the notion that creators and musicians ought to be paid. I think that if you take a look at what is taking place today, people have music on their iPhones today because they subscribe to Spotify or they access other services. Indeed, that's exactly what the industry said would happen any number of years ago. Indeed, the industry argued against the levies back as part of the 2012 reforms, in part because they said the world is moving towards, for music, more like a cable subscription type model. And in fact, they were right. If you take a look at the revenues for Soap, take a look at the Canadian music industry revenues. They are growing rapidly. In fact, we jumped ahead of Australia last year, the 6th largest music market in the world. SOCAN has record revenues being generated through internet streaming. And so the idea that consumers are going around listening to unpaid music actually is not consistent with what we're seeing take place as people move towards more and more paid streaming services for which they've paid for. And even to the extent to which there are still people out there who are buying CDs and then converting those CDs to listen to on their devices. I would submit to you that there surely is an implied license to be able to take the music that is on the CD and listen to it on the device of your choice, because no one would buy that thing if they were told that you can only listen to it off the CD itself in the context of your own home. And so the notion that we are still talking about peer-to-peer file sharing of music, which Sandvine tells us is virtually non-existent as a percentage of network traffic, strikes me as, with all respect, a little bit of an outdated conversation. The world has moved on. The industry's been successful. So how do artists get paid? They don't get paid by enforcement. They get paid by business models, and we're seeing those business models working.
Okay, you guys are really making me think here. Let me just take a breath. So in terms of traditional indigenous music, and so I'm not talking about powwow music or the music you hear from a tribe called Red. I'm talking about our traditional ceremonial songs that have been sung at the same time, in the same place, in the same way, in the same ceremony, year after year after year after year. And there are places and peoples who have done that and where that's done. That there's a legislative and a policy void for protecting those songs or imagery from being appropriated by an individual or an entity that can copyright and then convert it into something which they in turn sell for profit, and again which the peoples from which it originated either, number one, did not want commercialized, or number two, received no monetary remuneration for. And what I'll say in the policy and the legislative context is, with the endorsement, with the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its endorsement by the Government of Canada, the human rights framework within which Canada has declared it's going to operate changed. It's changed. And so it's opened up new rights. And then the realization of rights. It hasn't opened up new rights, but it's opened up the acknowledgement of rights. And so the final thing is, in that realm is what do peoples with the right to self-determination then want to do? Leave the laws within our own communities, or have the laws allowed for within Canadian legislation? So it's complicated. Now I'm making you guys think. I can see it.
We're going to open this up to questions in a second, but I got asked a question about two weeks ago by someone at Heritage who asked me, well, what 3 things would you like to see in the copyright, it coming from the copyright review? And I said, well, for us, in the journalism world where we're more than ever, we're seeing rip and read and complete cut and paste republishing of our articles with no credit. And when you're a subscription-based service like ours, that's robbery. We can't compete if somebody is just cutting and putting up a story on gun control or whatever on their site. And so I said we need some kind of a simple, small claims court kind of arbitration system for where we can make it inconvenient for anyone who does that. Maybe it's $400 is what I would pay a freelancer, so maybe that's a fair amount. And that it gets, we file it like a traffic ticket or whatever, and then they get noticed, they have to answer. That was one, and the other is a clearer, even clearer definitions of what's fair use, and I think that's where the sand is shifting, I think, always. And then I sat there dumbstruck thinking, gee, I don't have a third. So and I think that's where a lot of us are. It's like, what would we ask for if? So as we pass it around, please feel free to say if, what you'd like to see in a Copyright Act. But I'm going to ask you of all our panelists, what would you like to see from the copyright review? 1, 2, 3 things. Let's start with Barry.
So I thought, I'm in a position, I've got clients kind of on both sides of the aisle, so I will jump back and forth a little bit. I think the first thing, one of the things, separate and apart from the Copyright Act review, there's an ongoing review of the Copyright Board, which is very important. I think it's kind of...
So they're distinct, are they?
They are separate, but they're getting a little mingled.
Okay.
But I'd like to see, some real reforms coming out of that review to how the Copyright Board functions. I think it can do a lot of things better. Everyone that asks for the Copyright Board that is subject to its tariffs agrees that they take far too long to make decisions. We have decisions coming out that are 5 years after the hearing starts or after the proposed tariff, and then it's judicially reviewed, and then it goes to the Supreme Court and looking at decisions that are 10 to 20 years. So I'd like to see some reforms to the Copyright Board that are actually substantive and that actually improve the way it works. I think we can look to the U.S. copyright royalty judges as a model because they have a mandated time frame within which to make their decisions, and I think that would actually improve the processes, would create more certainty for businesses and users in Canada. So that's one. You touched on one of them. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about removing education as a fair dealing exception, and I think that's wrong. I don't think the issues that Access Copyright is having now arose from that amendment. Actually, those changes were in the works for a long time, resulting from changes in technology, changes in the way that educational institutions use information and materials in their classrooms. And I guess the third is more forward-looking, and that's something that I don't think has been discussed at all, but one of the things that Canada and the government has announced in the most recent IP strategy is removing barriers to innovation or for innovators, and one of the things that is being discussed in other countries is some sort of exception for data and text and data mining. That's a big thing. I think that's really going to be the next big thing. There's a lot of machine learning and AI technology innovation happening in Canada and abroad, and I wouldn't want to see any uncertainty in Canada push those innovators out of our country into other jurisdictions that have started to introduce exceptions for that type of use.
Okay, 3 things. So
Doesn't have to be true. What would you ask?
simply using the UN Declaration as a framework of principles as has been declared by the government, and somehow enabling the collective to have ownership with the intention of fostering cultural survival.
I was gonna say, do the old real estate thing and say, enforcement. But I won't, I think, well, actually I will, and I'll justify it with a story, an anecdote. I was, as James mentioned, I co-wrote actually the Ottawa Senators theme song year ad nauseum at the games, and I'm sure the players, I know the players are completely sick of it. But there was a situation where the Senators, and I should actually say that, you know, I get along very well. I just happened to be somebody that they had on staff that figured they could do this. You know, when I introduced the song to Bruce Firestone way back then and their team, you know, they were great guys to work with. You know, they had to pony up $50 million to join the NHL. That is basically a boys' club. So you know, we established some rules, and as I said, this is an example of, you know, creators and people, you know, whether they be innovators, and people that need to use private property. We came up with a great idea, you know, so they would be half cash, because, you know, exposure, like many other things, doesn't put food on the table. But then also we created a license between the two of us in how the song could be used. And they used it very, very well. Unfortunately, once, and this is years and years ago, different ownership, I went to a game once, and they had a magazine, I forgot the name of the magazine, but they basically published this monthly magazine talking about the team and that kind of thing. And they had, in the magazine, was a screensaver, if you remember those. And on it was, was the song, right? Which was, you know, an absolute no-no when it came to the contract. And, okay, well, who enforces this? I mean, I started a conversation saying, look, you know, this actually is a breach of the contract that we signed, the licensing. You're licensed to make copies of this without my permission and without my input in terms of, you know, how much I would make off of it. And I was kind of sort of sloughed off, and you know, I didn't hear a response for about 2 months. And then finally in January, when the season's basically half done, I got a call saying, well, give you 2 tickets in the nosebleeds, so you're gonna pay taxes on those. So anyways, that was just like, okay, wow, that's insane. You know, I looked to be quite honest with you, I looked to SOCAN, which is kind of the governing body of royalties in Canada. They have different ones in the States, but they basically distribute the money that's collected from bars, from you know, venues, from radio stations, TV stations, the internet. I say that, I'm not quite sure, but they weren't that much help either. So, you know, what I needed to do was basically spend money on a lawyer, and Barry and I were talking about this earlier on. We found somebody that actually was willing to take it on. You know, we couldn't afford someone, you know, being paid $500, $600 an hour. It's quite expensive for a musician. But basically, I had to take my own initiative. And you know, if I had a little bit of help, if I could, you know, call somebody and say, look, you know, this is what's happening. You know, can you help me with this? Other than, you know, I have to find legal representation. If those rules are enforced, if somebody could say, well, you can't do that, and here's why you can't do that, it would have been a little bit easier. But it took that. Finally, you know, we did get paid because it ended up, you know, the story ended up in the front of the Ottawa Citizen. The ownership then figured, well, we don't need this hassle. But it needs teeth. You know, laws like that need teeth, and they need allow musicians to basically pursue their hobbies, their interests, and their passion, without having to worry about things like you know, being having their work stolen, or having somebody else, which is the worst, making money off of it. So I would say again, enforcement would be a big thing from a musician's perspective.
At risk of harping on the CBC too much, Andy is a very mild-mannered person, but during the playoffs last year, 2 years ago, CBC began using your trumpet blare as part of their broadcast. And when he inquired, hey, wait a minute, you're filling your airwaves with my song, should I get paid for it? You got a stiff arm. So anyway, it's an example of
Well, I should clarify that because CBC, I hold great value to CBC. I think it does a wonderful job. But it was just one of those situations where, you know, with SOCAN, I had to go to them and say, look, you know, somebody's making money off of that song, and so can as well, like, it's incidental, right? So the team actually, I guess it was the playoffs that they made last year, 2 years ago. And during the broadcast, CBC would actually, the song is played when the players come into the ice and skate around. And if you can imagine, being a playoff game, it's very exciting. So, I was being told by SOCAN and by CBC lawyers that basically it's incidental music. It has nothing to do with the broadcast. They're not actually playing it. CBC, the producers, aren't using the song. I got them to, finally admit that, well, maybe it's actually not incidental, maybe it's background music, but it wasn't, because what was happening is the team came on, and Bob Cole, or whoever the color commentators were, they weren't talking during this part of the segment. And that occurred to me, well, they're stopped because they want that ambience to be an exciting part of the show, and it was a kind of exciting thing. But to me, that was my music being used to create revenues, or advertising revenues, for CBC, but they weren't acknowledging the fact that they weren't. So, all this to say, that ambivalence that I feel, sometimes because the musicians don't take that initiative, artists don't take that initiative. They have to. That's one thing that we have to learn as well. We have to get out there. We have to fight for it. You have to, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So it's incumbent on the musician as well to make sure that he's heard or she's heard and makes a lot of noise when something like this happens.
Michael, your wish list.
Sure. One's a fun story, but maybe I'll have a chance to after this, because it's an important one. So for the most part, people actually have been, sort of, at least from a user perspective, been talking about what not to do, because a lot of the stuff that we did in 2012 they got right. There was one change that I would have asked for, but I won't include in my 3, because the government's already indicated that they will make the change, and that has to do with abuse of the notice and notice system. And actually, Brian Matson highlighted the problem of when you try to turn enforcement into a parking ticket type situation, what you end up with is hundreds of thousands of demands against oftentimes innocent infringers or others who don't know better, who pay out that $400 because they don't know any better and they're scared. So there are real dangers with turning this into a parking ticket situation. But my 3, sorry, quickly, would be one I would and if I get kids for the day, I would make our fair dealing system, I would turn it into a such as, or what's known as a fair use approach. So I would get rid of, in a sense, education by saying that it's not a matter of whether or not you use this for education or news reporting or private study. That's not what determines fairness. What determines fairness of the use is the second part of the test. It's a 6-part test where you take a look at how much is being used, how it's being used, if it's being commercialized. The Supreme Court has already said it should have a very low threshold. And so frankly, I would open it up so that in theory anything could be a fair use, including text and data mining, which it should be, because what really matters shouldn't be the specific kind of use, the purpose of this, but rather whether or not it is fair. And that's where fairness is determined, not whether or not we slot it as criticism or private stuff. That would be one. The second would be to fix the mistake that the Conservatives made in 2012 on digital locks, where they created a restriction that removed the ability to use many of the fair dealing and other sorts of rights that people have in an analog world in a digital one. We're going to have forward-looking. This was clearly backward-looking, because it seems to me that you can have digital locks, but the idea that they remove or take away all the rights that users would otherwise have in an analog world creates a bizarre situation where we even have rights holders saying, well, you can't copy the DVD, but if you make a video cam picture of that DVD, you can go ahead and use it. That strikes me as kind of nutty. And if I had to pick a third, I would actually say that what we ought to do is that the government ought to lead by example and get rid of crown copyright. We've had governments that have regularly argued that they're all about openness and transparency, and yet we still have rules that restrict the ability to use government works under license. It is long past time to say that that simply isn't relevant in the current era, and that government works by default ought to be open and freely used by
Excellent. This is where I get to be Phil Donahue. That's a 50-year-old reference, so that's not copyright. Does anyone have questions? Put it open to you guys. It must be. Or something for the wish list.
I have a question.
I have a microphone.
Thank you very much. This has been really interesting and kind of mind-bursting. Why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult to grapple with this? It just seems, from what I've heard tonight, the digital intermediaries are making a lot of money. The artists are having a hard time surviving. Their royalties have gone down. Streaming has gone up. And by the way, I forgot to give a shout out to Jamie Douglas. He was, you may have noticed the Canadian playlist. He is a singer-songwriter, and he plays with a group called Power Goes. So I understand we have to protect the innovation and the tech innovation that's coming in. But what do we need to do to, I guess, expand digital copyright literacy? To, to your point, Andy, to get people kind of tuned into what they can do and how they can protect themselves. And secondly, to get government to be a little bit more nimble. It may be an ignorant question, but that's my question.
I'll start. I guess it's a lot of questions there. So it's difficult because there's money involved. I think that's really the bottom line. And where is that money going? So artists have kind of historically been underpaid, and that's the reality. And as the industry grows, they should share in the compensation. So it really maybe we need to look at where the money is actually going as these industries grow, and whether there's proper kind of sharing of the proceeds of this use. Can the government be more nimble? I don't know, maybe, but you see the same problem in other jurisdictions. Australia is doing a copyright review now, and they haven't done one in a decade or more. Europe is also are now looking at their directive on copyright. The last time they did that was in 2000. So we're not alone in the length of time it takes for us to make reforms. And I echo Michael's comment earlier. 5 years is the problem. I think we're not going to be done in the 5 years by the time the next 5 years rolls around. Potentially, maybe we will. But it takes a long time because the issues are so complex, and everyone should be consulted, and that takes time.
I'll respond to the suggestion that somehow Googles are making oodles of money and artists aren't. By saying that, I think every time we review copyright, there's a phenomenon that effectively boils down to blame copyright. That somehow the situations that we have in the marketplace are copyright's fault. With all respect, I think we heard that with your example, in an example that actually showed that copyright works in the sense that your rights are protected on your song. It's just there is a cost of enforcement. That's not copyright law's problem. That's an enforcement challenge that landlords face if the tenants don't pay, and there's just a myriad of issues. Enforcement is expensive, and that's a broad legal access to justice issue that I don't think is strictly a copyright issue. I would argue that the same is true with respect to what we see taking place today. So, for example, in the context of discussion we had before the industry committee on the use of fair dealing, educational institutions have provided real data on the percentage of the works that are being used through fair dealing. It turns out it's a really small percentage. In fact, they are not just that they are paying, but they are licensing the overwhelming majority of the works that they use. So, for example, the University of Guelph took a look at how of the sources of their materials for their course e-reserves. 56% of it came from site licensing. Another 25% of it came from open access, where the creators, the authors, had chosen to openly license their works themselves. Another 6% came from transactional licenses, where the university said, we don't have the rights, and so we're going to specifically pay for it. It was only 15 or 16%, hopefully that math added up, that was fair dealing. We're not talking about a significant percentage, and in fact, at the University of Calgary, they took a look at thousands of their materials that make their way into e-materials and found that only 8% were the result of fair dealing. So it's not just universities are paying, and they made that case, but in fact they are paying through licenses. So the question becomes, not is copyright causing the problem here, because I don't think it is. The problem is, why are authors not seeing their fair share out of what the emergence of a series of new licensing systems that have by and large replaced the access copyright system with a more flexible new license, but we certainly do get the sense and evidence from any number of creators that will make the argument that they aren't seeing the check. This was highlighted very quickly by one artist who appeared, I think it's either before Industry or Heritage, who noted that since the decline of the Access Copyright License, her revenues from her works had declined from, and I'm going to get the numbers a little bit wrong, but it was about $45,000 before, down to about $15,000. So it had massively declined. She noted that her Access Copyright check had dropped by about $1,500. And so the argument was, boy, there's a real problem that Access Copyright License is gone. And I took a look at those numbers and said, well, actually, your real problem seems to be, where's the other $30,000 that have declined? And part of that is changes in perhaps changes in technology, but I think more fundamentally, that some of the newer ways that have emerged to pay, so people are paying, may not be making their way down to the creators in the way that we would like, but I'm not convinced that that gets fixed by changing fair dealing. In fact, I think it's readily apparent that it doesn't get fixed by addressing fair dealing.
Do you have a question here, and if you'd like to address someone in particular?
This is a question to the panel. I just have a question.
Can you tell us who you are also?
Sure.
That'd be great.
My name is Katie, and I used to be an intellectual property lawyer, now I'm a public servant. And my question to you guys is, what do you think of GDPR, which is kind of the European directive on the general data and privacy regulation? Because, I've received emails from everything that I've ever subscribed saying that they've changed their policy regulations. And on top of that, we see kind of how one regulation affects multiple jurisdictions. Because, data is very permeable at this point, and information gets exchanged freely across borders. So what are your thoughts on, the effects of GDPR, and how does that impact copyright and, the future of copyright in Canada? That's it.
Yeah. Okay, so the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which took effect on May 25th, in the EU, sets a higher standard or threshold for privacy or data protection regulation on a global basis. It's had a very strong effect, and the reason everyone was getting a lot of those emails is that violations of those rules can result for affecting companies of up to 4% of global revenue. That's enough for large companies to pay attention to the rules. From a Canadian privacy perspective, I gave a keynote at the IPP, which is a large privacy organization, just a couple of weeks ago in Toronto, that argued that our current privacy rules, PIPEDA, are long overdue for change. It's not been 5 years. It's been, it'll be 20 years this fall from the time that PIPEDA was first introduced. We haven't seen significant change since then. And in fact, I think the urgency will increase in part due to GDPR, because Canada has what's known as an adequacy finding with the EU. The EU restricts the transfer of information across borders unless the third-party country has an adequate level of privacy protection. Canada received that adequacy finding when it passed PIPEDA, but I think there's a fairly compelling argument that we would no longer receive that adequacy finding based on the elevated standards that we've seen in Europe. And there will be we are due for a review, which has to conclude by 2021. And so it seems to me that the government needs to start putting this on the agenda because, as we know, it takes time to pass the legislation. As for how it affects copyright, I'm actually not convinced that it does. That's interesting.
We have another question here.
Hi, I'm Kim Handy, and I'm thinking with my hat of digital adoption and literacy. There's a discussion happening here on copyright, but at the same time, there seems to be, at the same time, like emerging with the what the business model should be in the internet and digital age. So I think that there's a discussion to be had. I don't know if it's at the Global Internet Forum or with the industry itself on where this merging is happening, because there seems to be like issues, like Michael was saying, that are not really copyright issues, that are actually industry issues. And with the issue of enforcement, I'm wondering, it's saying, going back to the industry, it's more like a preventive thing or incorporating it as a reality in the industry, because with the internet issues, not only for copyright but for other things as well, the content, maybe copyright, but the content on the internet, The big thing about enforcement is who should be policing it and who's going to pay for the cost. So in what point of the digital era is somebody going to be paying for the enforcement or the policing, and how that is not really built into the business model, perhaps. So I think that there's there's like a merging of the issues of copyright and the business models of the digital industry, which is, who should be doing what.
So is, like, what's, is there a question specifically?
Well, no, I mean, I think that we were having this discussion, and I think that, it's not like what do you think should be enforced, but I think it's an issue. If we're having this discussion around copyright, there's some issues that are not really copyright issues, that are industry issues.
Anybody want to address that? No. Fair comment? Okay.
Hi, Andrew Gibbs. My question is about the suggestion that ownership be amended to allow for collective ownership. And I guess I have two questions. The first would be, what changes you suggest to the term requirement to make those two things be able to work together? And secondly, I've also been told that the fixation requirement can be a big issue for First Nations groups in copyright. And if you have any comments on that, I would love to hear.
I don't think I'm going to give you the answer you may be wanting. So the term limit, my answer is I don't know. But it's something that would really need to be consulted upon in dialogue. And I don't say that in a cliche way. I don't think anybody knows. Because, like I said, with collective ownership, the objective is different, right? Your second question, can you repeat it?
So I've been told that fixation can be an issue for First Nations groups in specific with relations to dance and copyright, with some groups not wanting it to be recorded so they can retain control to only perform those dances in specific areas, but then being torn with the issue of if you don't fix it in some way, you have trouble having protection, and if someone else fixes it, then they own their video of the dance. I don't know if that's something you're interested in.
So, I said in the beginning, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm assuming that fixation is a legal term. I get the gist of it. Whoa, that's
It's another issue.
that's a really big question. It's kind of like, how can you copyright something that you've never documented, is basically what you're asking, right? So the way I'll answer it is this. Each respective nation or peoples would have to be allowed to make that determination for themselves. I'll give you a really, really old example. The Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. So, Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, those are her peoples, okay? Northern Vancouver Island and the islands off of Northern Vancouver Island. They were called the Kwagil. They were studied by Franz Boas in like the late 1800s. And he documented everything, right? He went to their ceremonies, he documented their languages, and there was so much controversy, even in the 1990s, about Boas's work and the work that he did with his sidekick, Hunt, I forget his first name, who wasn't Kwagil. He was from another nation, but he came in there and studied there, right? So they have everything documented. So now that so many old people have passed away, they're in the best position for language and cultural revival, because Boas documented everything. Whereas the nations where they didn't document everything are not in as good of shape. And then there are nations that have kept their doors closed to their ceremonies. I mean, literally. Like, you go in through the door, only First Nations people can go in, and then there's, like the internal security, for lack of a better word. You don't go in or out, right? during the ceremony, and there's no recordings, etc. But that's that individual people's right to make that choice. There's consequences to the choice, but that's their choice. So the question is, how can you cover that in legislation or in policy? I don't have the answer to that, but it does merit discussion.
Can I jump in?
I'll jump it in.
Exactly,
Give an
that's-
and just equate it to
We'll do one last question. Yeah,
But it is a choice, like you can choose to, if you're a company and you create something innovative and novel, you can choose to patent it and disclose it to the public and get your monopoly in exchange, or you can choose to treat it as a trade secret and keep it closely held, and then in that case, you run the risk of it being disclosed and being co-opted by someone else. So I think it is a choice, and if a band or tribe would like to not to fix something and copyright it and obtain profession that way and do it through like a trade secret, then that's a choice, I think. So that's kind of the business equivalent of it in the patent context.
I think I know that's the answer that the legal community's been giving for a very long time. You're in the system or you're out, take a pick. I think it's a somewhat unsatisfying answer though, to sort of say, hey, you either play by our rules, in which case you get protection, or you don't play by our rules, in which you don't, but perhaps there's some other benefits to you because you're not subject to the limitations of our system. I think the fact that you're raising the issues is incredibly important, and in fact, it's been one of the issues that has been highlighted by the committee for discussion. At WIPO, the Will Intellectual Property Organization, there is active work on what is sometimes referred to as TK, traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and these are really, really hard issues. Because I think as you really illustrated incredibly effectively, that it doesn't fit exactly within the system, and sort of say, well, it's up to you to fit within the system with respect to your traditions and knowledge, isn't consistent, I don't think, with the kind of the views of reconciliation that certainly our country and I think some others are trying to do. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I would say that it is really heartening that this would be, I'll contradict my earlier comment, this was too early for a review. It is at least nice that it is at least nice as part of this review. I think for the first time, these kinds of issues are on the table in a way that they haven't been.
Okay, one last question, and we're cognizant of the time, so I know finish up.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne Livingston, and I work for TELUS. So, those of you who know us mostly, I'm a self-publishing with nice little career commercials, but we actually have a TV service. And hence, we are a payer of many royalties by tariff and by negotiation. And so, Mr. Fong, one of the things that you mentioned about the copyright law and the delay in getting some of those tariffs, I'd like to emphasize how problematic that can be for a company when you don't know how much your business model is going to cost you, and you're 5 years in and you have no idea if you actually make money. Is that a profitable business, or is this a problem? So on Michael's point, which was not one of your priorities, but you did mention the notice regime and the good news that abusive types of notices will be addressed. And I think it's not just these demands for payments that need to be addressed, because we as a company really like to have a good relationship with our customers, and so the idea that we're sending off these abusive notices that we know our customers are probably going to end up paying when they shouldn't be, is very much a problem. We have to do it by law at this point. And now, more and more, there's the danger that when we send these attachments along, there could be malicious software, like malware, included in the attachments that we're sending. So some of our security people are saying, man, I don't want to send this along. We don't want to send this. And I'm like, well, there's statutory damages if you don't. So all of these things, I agree, aren't necessary to change by law. These are things that can change by regulations or other things. Do you think they will precede these potentially very lengthy legislative amendments? Are we going to see some real action soon on these incredibly pressing problems?
Well, I'm just a guy shouting from a blog, but I think there's reason to hope, given that the government has emphasized it as part of a broader IP strategy, that if they do move forward with an IP strategy, that will be part of it. And I think it could be fixed by way of regulation, but I don't think it's the only way to do that. And my general sense was that the signal that we got from the government was a recognition that this copyright review will take a fairly long time. One of the questions that has come up repeatedly during the hearings to witnesses has been, Well, you know that this isn't going to result in legislation for the next election, and so what does that mean from a timing perspective? My guess is that both the copyright board stuff as well as the IP strategy stuff, which is all part of an IP strategy, might well be part of what the government tries to do before we get to the next election.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Andy, Michael, Barry, Val. It's been an interesting, fascinating